We have with us today a very special guest by the name of Curtis McClarty. Curtis is going to talk to us about his experience as an exoneree from Oklahoma's death row. That is to say that Curtis is a completely innocent man who spent 22 years of his life on death row in Oklahoma City. So Curtis, thank you for taking time to do this interview today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Unfortunately, I don't have any money to pass you. This is fully volunteer. I hope you knew that ahead of time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, Curtis, could you start out just by telling us a little bit about who you were prior to being wrongfully placed on death row, and how you got to where you are today, and why you're out speaking about death row?
Okay. You had a typical childhood. I was a good kid. I did well in school. I appreciated education. I participated with my family in community events. It seemed to have a promising future for myself, but when I turned 15 years old, I started taking drugs. And within a year, I was alienated from my family, from my community. I was no longer in school. And I lived that life for until I was incarcerated, basically. It's how I came to know the victim in the case. It's what made me vulnerable to that kind of prosecution, a malicious prosecution. The people in the state government in Oklahoma, knowing what kind of person I had been, knew that they could use that information against me, that I was essentially disposable. That if any questions arose regarding the circumstances of the prosecution and my guilt or innocence, that public opinion would probably weigh against me because of the kind of life that I led. In 1982, I was 20 years old. I was still living that life of petty crime and drug abuse, alcohol abuse. That's how I came to meet this young woman named Pam Willis. Pam was the daughter of an Oklahoma City police officer. Despite having a good upbringing herself, she had made the same decisions I had as a teenager, started taking drugs and dropped out of school. I didn't really know her. She was just an acquaintance. I knew who she was. In December of 1982, she was found murdered in her home. It wasn't an accident or a suicide. It was a murder, no doubt about it. Being a member of law enforcement, the ensuing investigation was intense, widespread, and by all accounts, it was professional. They did a really good job in the initial phases of the investigation, securing evidence, canvassing the neighborhood, creating a substantial and concise record of what they discovered. One of the things that they did was interview every young man who knew Pam, and I was one of those young men. In February of 1983, I was invited to the police station as well to answer questions about her homicide. I went to the police station voluntarily. I signed waivers freely to give hair and blood, saliva, fingerprints, palm prints. I gave the police a statement regarding my whereabouts and my knowledge of the crime, how it was that I knew her, etc. At the end of the day, they told me that I was free to leave, because they had no further questions for me, and I didn't hear from them again for 2.5 years. In 1985, the spring of 1985, the police heard a rumor that I told someone that I knew who killed Pam. and it wasn't true. I had only repeated a rumor myself that it must have been her drug connection who killed her. What they heard was that I said my drug connection killed her, and that wasn't true. Before they could find out where I was the second time, they did more digging into my background, found out who I was and the kind of life that I led, and I guess that they decided they didn't like me very much. You know, I can't say I blame them. I didn't live a moral life at the time. I was, selfish. I was a drug addict, and I had inadvertently made myself vulnerable to that kind of manipulation. I didn't know it at the time, but I found out about it soon enough. My second encounter with the Oklahoma City police detectives, the first encounter was voluntary. The second one wasn't. The second time I was taken by force and taken to the police department. They told me what the allegation was, that they believed that I had some sort of guilty knowledge about the crime. And despite my protests of ignorance, they just, I don't understand what happened that day. I know some of the psychological factors that went into it. Principally that Pam was a police officer's daughter, and it was something of an embarrassment to the district attorney's office and the police department that the crime had gone unsolved for almost 3 years. They didn't like me. They had that pressure to solve the crime. And as events unfolded that day, as they became increasingly aggressive and violent